Namaste, yogis. How are you? I am here today with my special guest, Jeff Tretsven on our Meet a Yogi. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Jeff is a nonviolence communication expert. He has been teaching nonviolent communications for 11 years, and he studied with Marshall Rosenberg, who is the founder of Nonviolent Communications, and assisted organizing a conference, an international intensive training with Marshall Rosenberg. He also has a background in adult training in the military and in technology. Jeff works with people privately by Zoom video conference, and he can actually just work with you to give you empathy, or he can coach you on how to use nonviolent communications yourself. And he also works as a mediator, and he can do that in person or from online through Zoom video conference. Tonight we're going to be talking about mindful speech, 3 key distinctions. And Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about just how nonviolent communications works for people who may not be familiar with it?
Okay, so basically one of the most important things is there's a lot of confusion about the name. So if you're to think of it as more compassionate communication, would be something that's easier for people handle because people think, well, I'm not violent, but it's not about not being violent. It's more like the way nonviolence was used by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, as where, you love people so much you wouldn't think of harming them, which is in a way that ahimsa, the Sanskrit word that's translated to nonviolent violence, comes in.
And we in yoga are more familiar with that term ahimsa, but my understanding from conversations we've had is that there was concern that people might not be familiar with that term, and that is why they chose the term nonviolent, but that really it was ahimsa.
Right, and Marshall actually would have preferred to use ahimsa, but because it connected him with like people involved in the civil rights movement, that he went with nonviolent communication. And that's where he started. He was doing mediation for desegregating schools in the South.
Right. And I just want to let you know we had another participant join, and so for that participant, I just want to let you know that you are muted. Your camera is off while we're recording this conversation, but if you have any questions, you can just put them into the chat window, and I will ask them of Jeff. And then after we're done with the recording, you'll have an opportunity to open up the mics and speak with them. Nonviolent Communications, founded by Marshall Rosenberg, and what can you tell us a little bit about sort of the basic skills that are used when you work with nonviolent communications?
Okay, so it's almost like learning a foreign language using the same words in English, because you're using the language in such a totally different way. And kind of the 4 components of it are basically observations, what you see or hear, separate from any evaluations. And then when you see that observation, you'll think about it, and then depending on how you think about it, you'll have feelings come up. And so the feelings is the second component. And then your feelings tell you whether your needs are met or not met. So basically, like the real basic thing is if you're thirsty, you want water. If you're hungry, you want food. Those are the essential things. And then there's also the relationship things. Like if you're angry, you probably want respect or consideration or understanding, something like that. So needs are.
So it's observations, which is just the circumstance, feelings, what you're feeling about that circumstance, and then the need that feeling is pointing to.
Right.
And I think that we should talk about those needs a little bit.
So what did you want to?
Like you said, thirsty. Like, does that mean like I need a Coca-Cola?
No, it's general. It just means you want some kind of, water is what you really need. And the water can come in various forms, like it can be, like Coca-Cola or juice or coffee. So that would be the strategy would be the specific way that you bring water in, but the need for water is just kind of a general universal thing. And then it's not attached to
general, and then like how you actually would meet that need would be your strategy for meeting the need.
Right. And what the persons are involved in it, that would be part of the strategy too. So people, like a good example of where this causes problems is like in a couple that's in a romantic relationship, they might think the only place they can get their need for like intimacy or whatever is not necessarily sex, but just like emotional intimacy is through their relationship. And then that puts a real heavy burden on one person. Whenever you depend on only one person to meet your needs, that's where a lot of problems come in. Because nobody can completely satisfy you all the time.
So having your partner do it is a strategy, but the need of intimacy could be met by anyone.
Right, yeah. And, well, anybody who's skilled enough to connect with you in the way that works for you.
So we had talked about like, so the sort of skill is to connect these things together. That so can we give an example of, you know, like a full complete statement where it has an observation, a feeling word, and then a need?
Okay, and the request, we didn't talk about the request.
Oh, and the request.
So the request is a strategy, and that's how you want somebody to change their behavior. Basically, and that's if you have a negative emotion, then eventually you're going to have a request if you're going to use this. Okay. If you're feeling a positive emotion, then you can express gratitude, but there's no request. You don't want any change, so you're just letting somebody know, I like what you're doing, which is kind of a request to keep doing it.
So like maybe I could, to use our thing about thirst, like I could say like, oh, when I see you drinking that soda, it makes me realize that I'm feeling thirsty and I think I need some water. And then I could make a request like, could you give me one of those sodas?
Well, okay, so the observation would be like my mouth or my throat is dry.
Okay.
And then I can notice, well, I'm feeling thirsty, and then I can say, well, I have a need for water, and then would you be willing to give me a soda?
I like how you make your requests. Would you be willing?
Right. So you want to let people know they have a choice, because if they don't hear that they have a choice, they would hear it as a demand, and then they're going to resist it. And then one of the hardest things is if somebody says no, how do you deal with the no? That's probably, I would say that's the skill you want to have before you start practicing this with people, is you want to be able to hear a no and then empathize with them, guess at what their feelings and needs are that they're saying no to your request. Okay.
It sort of started out sounding really simple, and then it seemed like I heard like all these sort of difficult things that come up in doing it. We gave this example of sort of, a drink of water, but that's not really generally when people are using this skill, is it?
No, it's more about, relationship stuff, but it's better to start with a simple example. But it's also if you're meditating and I say just sit there and don't think about anything, that sounds like a pretty simple thing to do. So there's a difference between simple and easy. So nonviolent communication is very simple, but because we've been taught how not to do it for so long, that's where the difficulty comes in.
When I started learning about this, what I really found was hard was to tune into my own emotions. I found that I was extremely good at reading what I thought other people's emotions were and reacting to it, but that it was very difficult for me to in the moment be aware of my own feelings.
Right, and to me that's when I really got skillful at it, was when I was able to put a word to my emotions. Then it seemed like everything else just kind of fell in place. So I think that's one of the most important things, is developing an emotional vocabulary.
I also noticed that as I've worked with you, that you kind of have this matrix of connecting feelings and needs where you kind of know what a feeling, what need it points to. Like if somebody's feeling angry, then it's pointing to a need for respect. Or if somebody's sad, then it's pointing to a need for comfort. Or, I actually don't know them all the way you do. So,
well, sad's the one you can't tell. That's like the universal negative feeling that could apply to any need. But the other ones, like disappointed, means you're expecting yourself or somebody else to accomplish something. So then the need would probably be like competence or effectiveness. And like anger, you'd mentioned that, yeah, it's usually respect, consideration, and then freedom. If you think of like a 2-year-old, if you take away their freedom, then that's where anger comes in.
And then what are a couple of other ones like that?
Well, can you throw out an emotion and I'll...
Sure. Let's do despair.
Okay. So despair would probably some self-acceptance and self-love, and then maybe love from other people, hope would come in.
And then what's it like? Frustration.
Frustration would be like effectiveness, competence.
And then they also apply to sort of what we think of the more positive emotions as well, correct?
Right. Yeah. When you have positive emotions, then your needs are met. And that's one of the things that's probably not focused on enough, because we like to fix problems, so we focus on the negative things. So like, well, Suzanne, I see we're doing this video, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity, and it meets my need for support and connection and fun to make this video.
See, this is nice. I actually really like that. I feel like we should do one where we just only work on like happy, positive observations, because it seems like, it's such a struggle to do the ones that are when you're not getting your needs met.
So which do you prefer? Thanks, Suzanne, for doing this video, or the nonviolent communication day?
Yeah, so I like that one.
So you like the nonviolent communication?
I love the nonviolent communications one. It's very heartfelt.
Yeah, instead of just saying thank you.
That's the thing about nonviolent communications, is it's very raw. And that is we talk about all these skills, but then, that's the trick, is that when you're learning all these skills, it can become very intellectual. Like you're trying to figure out like, oh, sad, what do they mean? And it kind of becomes this obstacle. But the point of all of this is to get to where you can be raw and real and open with people.
Right. And I would say, if you want to use the left brain, right brain kind of thing, is I would say it actually uses both parts of the brain. So you need your logic brain to remember the kind of the formula and what are the components. But then once you're into feelings, to connect with your feelings, that's that's the right brain part of you, and the needs is also the right brain. And when you focus on the needs energy, that also connects you to your intuition. And then when you come up with your strategies, after connecting with your needs first, your strategies are very different than if you are like angry, and you don't connect with, well, what is my feeling and what's my need? And then go straight from anger to strategy. That's when you do really stupid things, and things don't work out the way you want them, and then you wonder, why is my life like this? And it's because you're acting before you really connect with what's important to you.
I think the sort of logical part of it is useful when you're dealing with somebody who's really what they call in the nonviolent communications the jackal language, where somebody who's sort of coming at you with a lot of emotion and just kind of fighting with you, like somehow getting into that more intellectual space can be useful to me for pulling away a little bit from my knee-jerk reaction to their intense emotion.
Well, that's actually one of the benefits of doing an observation, is that it gets you into the non-emotional part of your brain. And if you're like really angry, that actually calms you down. And then there's a term in psychology, they call it flooding, where when you get angry, your body releases all these chemicals, and then it just continues the anger. And then by taking the time to step back and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? It actually disconnects you from that anger, and it's kind of a soothing thing. And so you're not going to go straight from anger to love, so it's actually good to have the intellectual thing to kind of calm down the anger before then you try
and to take care.
Right.
You've said in the past that you sort of can move people a certain level and in their communication at a time. And so, like you were saying, that you can't go from anger directly to love, like you're just not going to switch like that. So if you're working with somebody, the goal isn't to just totally flip the communication, but to sort of move it in a more...
Right, you want to go in steps. The intention is eventually you want to get them to, a positive emotion, but you're not going to go straight from there, but you kind of go through, take baby steps to work them up, kind of like an emotional scale, to more and more positive. And if you take somebody from depression and you can coach them into anger, you're actually doing them a favor, because it's much better, much healthier for you to be angry than it is for you to be depressed.
Oh, interesting. But
the other thing is, it's not good to leave them in anger, because then they might do things they might regret, and then they'll go back to being depressed again.
Well, you had said that like the very first skill is observation, and we kind of talked about emotions, and we talked about needs a little bit, and then we briefly talked about requests, but we sort of skipped through the skill that you've told me in the past is really the most difficult, which is observation. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you make an observation that doesn't, like, why is that such a difficult skill, and how do you make a good observation?
Okay, so what you wanted as an observation is what you see or hear. So what you typically hear, if you can give a direct quote, that would be a good observation. And then sometimes describing what you see can be a little more challenging. And the trick is, like, if I see somebody smiling, not to say like I see they're happy, because I don't really see they're happy. I see their face, and I see the corners of their mouth come up in a smile. I can see that, but I can't see what their emotional state is.
So the fact that, like, if you said I see that you're happy, that's actually not an observation. That's really an interpretation, right?
Right. It's an evaluation or interpretation, or my guess of what their intention is. And the idea of the observation is, if somebody does the process with, if somebody does something I don't like and I want to let them know about it, first I have to let them know what I'm talking about. So the observation kind of creates a context. And so you want it to be as easy to hear as possible. So you want it to be, this is what I heard and this is what I saw. So, like, I saw you take money out of the piggy bank, or whatever, if you're talking to a kid. And that's something, you saw them do that.
So you would say, I saw you taking money out of the piggy bank, instead of, I saw you stealing.
Right.
Which is an evaluation.
Right. But like, another thing is, like, say, somebody scheduled a meeting at 12 o'clock and everybody is in the room at 12 except for one person, and another person walks in at 12:10. That's the observation, is the meeting was scheduled for 12 and this person walked in at 12:10. So saying they're late is not an observation. Late is a conclusion you reach comparing the time scheduled to the time that the person walked in. And it seems like a silly, picky thing, but if you're telling the person you're late, they're going to be defensive. But if you say the meeting was scheduled for 12 and you walked in at 12:10, they might still be a little defensive depending on the circumstance, but it's going to be a lot less than if you say you were late.
So it's the skill of it to be as neutral as possible. And how do you do that? Because, like, for example, like, to me, the distinction between you walked in at 12:10 and you're late, I would probably just say you were late. I'm not even sure, like, if I would be aware that was an evaluation.
Right. And you don't have to, be perfect in this language all the time, but just be aware if the person reacts, you can say, okay, I'm kind of throwing an evaluation out there. And then you can step back and say, well, maybe I want to, think about how I'm doing this if they're reacting in that way.
Well, I feel like we've kind of, talked about it and like, okay, there's this step, there's this step, there's this step, and it all sounds very complicated. I mean, what exactly are these skills really meant to get you to? And when you become very fluid with them, all of this is sort of like learning the ABCs, but what does it look like when you're, actually able to like, sing the full concerto?
Well, actually, what it really does for you is it brings peace to you. So if you see somebody's coming in late, you're probably feeling annoyed or irritated or frustrated at them. But if you see somebody as the meeting was scheduled at 12 o'clock and they're coming at 12:10, then there's kind of a more open curiosity of maybe I'm wondering if they were stuck in some other meeting and they weren't allowed to leave, if their car had a problem, or somebody asked them to do a favor for them at the last minute. And it's just, your heart's a little more open saying, this is when the meeting was scheduled and this is when you came in, than saying you're late. And it feels harder in my heart to say you're late than it does to just kind of give a neutral report of the facts. So it's actually healthier for me to say it that way, that I'm not picking up that negative emotion from accusing somebody of something.
Right. And so you really see it as a practice. It's really becomes not so much about the interpersonal skill as about the effect on yourself, that you practice it for your own sense of ahimsa rather than just necessarily in your communication to create ahimsa.
Right. And it helps communicating with other people. To me, what Marshall Rosenberg did is he basically documented how people like to be talked to. And that's basically what the nonviolent communication process is. So I'll hear people say there's too many rules in it, but it's not really nonviolent communication rules. It's the rules people have of how they would like to be talked to. And I kind of lost track of what we were talking about.
Oh, yeah, no, that's okay. I just wanted to get into sort of a more fluid understanding of it, because I think we kind of jumped right into these skills, of observation, emotions, needs, requests, which are the sort of basic building blocks. But then, I think I just personally wanted to move people forward in their understanding of what is the point of using these skills. And the point is not to make communication become this super structured thing, but to teach you the fundamental skills that it takes in order to create more loving interactions, and also to create, a calm spirit within yourself, so that you're not constantly engaging in a very combative form of interaction, which is what I see, particularly online all the time, is how people sort of really quickly jump into judging each other, getting very combative. And I think more and more, to me personally, there's been a search for how can I change that sense of argument and logic that seems to be there in these online communications.
But now I remember where I was trying to go with that point. Okay, we all think we want people to love us, but what we really want is we want to be loving to others. That's what feels good, is when we love others. So if somebody's loving to me, it's easy for me to be loving to them. But that doesn't prove that I'm a loving person. What proves I'm a loving person when I'm dealing with a difficult person and I can be loving, then I really know truly I'm a loving person. That's what really feels good. And that's what everybody wants, is to feel good. And the best way to feel good is to be a loving person. Then you're not judging yourself saying, oh, I should have been nicer, I should have done this or that.
When you realize that you're doing it for yourself, then it does totally change what this practice is about, because it's not about you trying to manipulate the other person into a result, or to try to force this relationship to become loving. You realize no, it's only about me and my, what I'm trying to state, that I'm not mad at myself for how I approached this conversation, and whether how the other person responds is really up to them.
Right. But it gives you feedback. If somebody responds negatively, then there might be something you could do better. So if you have the intention of being loving, but you're hurting people, then maybe your skill level needs some work or something.
It's very strange to me when I've been practicing it, and the few times when I feel like I've managed to actually exercise the skills, I almost feel like my brain turns inside out or something. Like it's so the opposite of how I've been taught to speak, and I think how a lot of people have been taught to speak, which is much more sort of focused on winning, being right.
And what was funny is when you give up being right, then you get your way more often. Because people pick up on your attitude, and if you don't have resistance, then they don't fight back with you. But we still haven't, I don't know how long you want to go on this, but we still haven't talked about separating an observation.
Okay.
From
So why don't we plan to go for maybe another 10 minutes or so based on when we started recording, and and we'll kind of find that natural point. But I would love to talk about observation some more, because it is such a challenging skill to actually do.
What I want to say is what we're trying to separate it out from. So what we want to separate out is the observation from the evaluation, and then from how we feel about it. So like the example I gave, I see you're angry, that I can't actually see you're angry. I can see smoke coming out of your ears or something like that. Or I can see your face turn red. I can see you, holding your fists up, or, clenching your jaw. Those are things I can see. Those would be observations. Then my thinking is, well, if she's clenching her jaw and her face is turning red, she's probably angry. So we want to separate out, well, which is an observation and which is thinking. And then when I think you're angry, then that's where my emotion comes from. And my response when I think you're angry is I'm probably going to be angry. So my emotion doesn't come from my observation. My emotion comes from what I think about the observation.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, I've had that actually happen. My husband actually, sometimes his hearing isn't so good, and then he kind of speaks a little louder, and I'll interpret it as anger, but actually he'll say like, "No, I'm not angry," but I'm like, "Well, you must be," because you're talking like you're angry, and so it's I can definitely relate to that experience of making an evaluation about what that behavior means.
Right, and then the saying "you must be," that's probably irritates him even more, right? Because you're assuming what's going on in his head.
Yes. Well, that was what I was saying, is that, I learned that I thought I was very, very good at picking up on other people's emotions. And it's kind of been shocking to me as I've been studying this to realize that I really don't know what other people are thinking. And Karen joined us. Thank you for joining, Karen. I didn't notice that you had joined. So during observation, do we verbally say to a person what we are seeing? Like in yoga, when you see someone forcing a pose.
Okay, so what you would say is what you see them doing, that you're interpreting as forcing a pose. So forcing is your interpretation, and then maybe you're seeing that they're grimacing, but what would you, let's see, well, you'd have to type it in, I guess. So what would you be seeing that would lead you to the conclusion that they're forcing a pose? Could you give an example?
And if she doesn't, then if she doesn't type it in, then I'll give you an example. Grinching their teeth.
Okay. So yeah, see, that would be the observation, is they're grinching their teeth, and then the thought would be that they must be forcing a pose. And then your emotion might be concern or something like that for their well-being, that they don't hurt themselves.
So then, can you give it sort of the complete statement that you might say all the way from observation, emotion, etc.?
Okay, so when I see you doing awkward pose and you're grinching your teeth, I'm concerned, and about your well-being. So would you tell me, then you probably want to ask them what's going on for them. Would you tell me how you're doing or something like that, or what's going on for you?
I've noticed you use that phrase. You have a few phrases that I've noticed that you use, like what's going on for you. I've also heard what's alive in you sometimes in nonviolent communications. And then I also heard sort of the use of the word willing a lot more than I do in normal conversation. So are those sort of phrases that people pick up that kind of help to soften things? Or
well, the would you be willing, that's kind of Marshall's way to start a request. That he came up with is like the gentlest way of, letting somebody know that they have an option on whether they say yes or no.
She says, I like the phrase, what's alive in you.
Okay, in a nonviolent communication, that's basically what are you feeling and needing is what you're looking for.
And he actually spoke about, that was what he said was really like the heart of it, is that when you really are feeling empathy, that you're able to see what's alive in people. And that I really love that, seeking for that. As I've been working with people, I sort of wait for that, like, oh, here's where the light comes on in them. Here's where they come alive, trying to find that in people more.
And I want to talk a little bit about emotions before we finish this. And one of the key things is also separating emotions from evaluations. So if I say something like, I feel criticized, I'm actually criticizing the person and not expressing an emotion.
Oh, yeah. That one, that I feel, or I feel like, that is the deadly one, because a lot of people, they'll say, and I do it too, like, I feel like you're being a jerk. So that's not a real observation, right?
Well, it's not a feeling. Yeah, just because I've had this argument with several people that, well, I use the word feel, therefore it's a feeling. And what they're saying is emotional charge. So like we'll use the I feel criticized. When somebody were to say I feel criticized, they'd probably be hurt or angry or frustrated, depending on what's going on for them. But criticize is a description of the other person's behavior. So we want to make sure when we're using the word feel, we're actually expressing an emotion, a word such as happy, angry, sad, frustrated, disappointed, irritated, annoyed.
Well, there's a few of those that I think are a little bit like that, like disappointed or hurt, where it sort of implies that the other person is doing something to you. And it's not really a completely sort of, expression of what's happening in you.
Okay, and some people they won't use the word disappointed, they'll use disappointment instead. And some people try to not use any words that end in ED. But I think that's taking it a little too far. But if you follow the emotion immediately with a need, then you don't have to worry about somebody taking it as like criticizing them, because then you immediately focus their attention on the need energy.
And so, for example, in this example that Karen gave about when she observed somebody clenching their teeth in the pose, then what is the need that is there for her?
Well, it would be well-being. You don't want somebody to hurt themselves.
So you have a need. So you would say, like, when I observe you gritting your teeth while you're in this position, I'm concerned about your well-being, or I'm concerned and I need to know that. How would you say that? I need.
Well, I would just say, I usually you don't want to include a person with a need, but for when you talk about somebody's well-being, that's a place where even Marcia would do that. Like I'd say, I'm concerned about your well-being.
Okay.
It's not going to stir up anything by assigning it to that it's their well-being.
I've sort of been focusing on sort of getting this specific language right, but then I think the main thing is that you sort of hit the need correctly by the end of it, that they're hearing the need, that's the sort of key point that often we don't get to in conversation is, well, what are you actually needing?
Right. And then you also want to follow the need immediately with the request. So that's where, like, would you tell me what's going on for you, or would you ease up on your pose? You know, something like, you can have, there's 3 times a request. You can ask them what's going on for them, which is a check-in kind of request. And you can ask them if they heard what you said. So if you're giving somebody a really difficult message, you want to make sure that they understood what you said. So that's where you can say, would you tell me what you heard me say? And they might say something like, you think I'm a jerk. And then the hard thing is to say, well, thank you for letting me know that I wasn't as clear as I'd like to.
I really screwed that up.
well, let me try again. Well, you don't want to say I screwed it up. You want to focus on that you weren't as clear as you'd like to be. So,
okay.
So you want clarity to be the need that you're focusing on, maybe clarity or understanding.
See, I still need to work on the nonviolent communications with myself.
For your internal dialogue?
Yes. We did a call about that last time, I think it was, that we talked about the internal dialogue, and that is amazing. The internal stuff is really the heart of it for me personally.
But that's the hardest one to work on, because you're so involved and it's hard to be neutral talking to yourself.
Yeah.
And have the distance and really, you know, take a look, step back and take a look at it.
Well, could you give us, we had sort of said we want to talk a little bit about observation, and we kind of talked about it, and then we kind of move away from it. And so I know you said that, you know, it's really about making sure that you're really super neutral and specific about what you're doing. Are there any tips for doing this? Because I know that you're very good at giving observations.
But it takes practice, because you're not used to doing it. And some people it's really a challenge to get them to make an observation. I'll have to ask them over and over again, what did this person say? Can you give me a direct quote? And I keep thinking of new ways to get them to say, what were the words that actually came out of this person's mouth? And then sometimes they'll go, oh, and then they'll quote it, but they're more interested in telling the story that supports their side of the observation and why they're upset about the observation than telling you what the observation is. So
yeah.
It's challenging to get people to let go of their story and say, well, what really happened here?
I've seen sometimes people will sort of, as soon as you get really close to a good observation, they sort of bounce away and start talking about something else.
Right. Well, there's a real vulnerability to nonviolent communication, and some people aren't comfortable with being that vulnerable. And so when you know, well, if I was to notice that, then I would back off and do something else. You know, if you're like, we're in a class or something and somebody's trying to make an observation and then they just go off into other things, and I switch to empathy and just offer them empathy. And then hopefully if they calm down enough or they get enough empathy, then they can try an observation again. But if somebody's really upset, they probably can't make an observation. It's just beyond their capacity.
Do you still sort of, I mean, when somebody's act like that, I think we have a natural tendency to sort of respond or react to another person who is in distress. So what do you do to sort of not take that on? It seems like that's kind of part of the skill of this, is not to bite into that natural response to another person's distress.
Okay, that's one of the secrets of empathy. What's the distinction between empathy and sympathy? So if sympathy is, if you're feeling bad, I feel bad. And empathy is, you feel bad and I stay connected with myself and I feel good. And then I provide the support that you can, you know, if you want to share what's going on for me and have it not be recognized by another human being, that you will feel better in the process, which if I join you in sympathy, I'm not doing you any good. Now we're both miserable. Yeah,
and that's such a huge distinction. And I see that, you know, that sort of interplay all the time, that people think, you see online, I have a lot of friends who call themselves empaths, where they'll say, you know, basically like they have this tendency to really sort of take on the emotions that other people are expressing. They're very sensitive to it. And, you know, I think what you're saying is that really is being more sympathetic than it really is being empathetic.
Right. In science, they call it like two tuning forks that vibrate. We hit one and the other vibrates. That's a sympathetic vibration because they're both vibrating at the same frequency. And so for me, I use that kind of definition. If you're feeling the same thing, that's sympathy, that's not empathy.
And so if you were to use this tuning fork example, what would it look like for an empathetic response?
Okay, so it'd be like maybe you had 100 tiny tuning forks, and they're all tuned to a different frequency. So when this other tuning fork is vibrating, then one of these little picks it up and says, yes, this is the frequency, but you don't really feel it because it's just a little tiny tuning fork, but you feel it enough so you can identify for them kind of what they're feeling, and then you create that connection, but you don't take on their pain or anything. You just kind of tune in enough to say, so you can make a good guess, is this what you're feeling? And then having somebody guess your feeling, even if you're not right, it shows that you care, that you took the time to figure out, well, is this the feeling that they might be feeling, and you guess it.
So you're still sort of vibrating with them a little bit, but you're not like just completely overwhelmed by it.
Right, you're not joining them, you're just reaching out enough to acknowledge that is this your experience.
I see. That's really lovely.
But you do take it on a little bit, but it's real tiny.
I like it. So I feel like we're sort of hitting a nice winding up point where I felt like we kind of started with the skills and the very specifics of it. And now I feel like we're sort of getting to what does this create when you practice these skills, and where do you get to as a person in your body and in your connection with people, why you want to practice this. So before we end the recording, did you feel like there was anything more that you wanted to share?
We had another question.
Oh, sure. Do you think it's therapeutic when people do want to tell their side of the story, to let them go and tell them thanks for sharing?
Yeah, and actually that's what, it's funny because I'm reading Carl Rogers' book, which is where Marshall Rosenberg was a student of Carl Rogers. And he found that the most therapeutic thing is for somebody to be basically nonviolent communication, empathy. And then also, like if I was doing empathy for somebody else, also my sharing honesty of, when I hear your story, this is what goes on for me. That is the other part that's really important to the therapeutic relationship, which is actually unethical for people who have psychology licenses. And then the other thing that is important to the therapy process is whether we don't really use the word therapist in nonviolent communication, but whether the person in that role cares or not. So it's nonviolent communications that, other than the caring, is the only part you need to add in. If you do the nonviolent communication, you do what's most healing. And in his research, that's what the therapist said they wanted. If they were to see a therapist, that's what they would want the therapist to do. Those skills they would want the therapist to be good at. And
so if you just say thanks for sharing, and does that help to create that feeling? Or
well, you'd say thanks in nonviolent communication instead of just saying thanks for sharing. Say when you well, first you'd acknowledge but you'd give them empathy and acknowledge what their feelings and needs were. And then, so when they calm down and talk, you can say, well, when I hear you share that, I feel, whatever, trying to think about a word that's not, I feel glad, and my need for connection has been met, something like that.
And she said, you mean thanks for caring for me?
So that, which person would that be coming from?
So when somebody says thanks for caring for me, is that the person who's telling the story, Karen? No, me. I'm not quite sure what. Oh, for you. So as the person who's hearing the story, thanks for caring for me. You would be saying that. Yeah. So when they're telling their side of the story, I guess we're a little unclear about what your question is. So maybe if you could rephrase that, please.
Yeah, I would say that thanks for, willing to be vulnerable and share what's alive in you would be kind of what I would be saying.
And so so that's sort of a similar way to say that same thing, that thanks for sharing, which I think sometimes does sound a little cold, like a little bit like, okay, yeah, I heard you, but I didn't totally hear you. And so what they would say as, thanks for, I feel alive, like you would actually be sharing your feeling of, I feel happy that you trusted me enough to share that with me, or I feel my need for connection was met when you shared that story with me. It's honestly, Jeff, it's kind of uncomfortable to hear these, these kinds of expressions, because they are very vulnerable.
And Marshall actually tells a story about that with him, that he was worked with a woman that would play music for him, and she's expressed appreciation to him, and then he kind of did like, it's no big deal. And then he scolded him because he wasn't accepting what she was saying, and he kind of had to really look at himself and say, yeah, I am not celebrating that somebody's appreciating what I do. So it's really hard sometimes to accept appreciation, because we've been taught we're supposed to be humble, and so.
Well, I hope that you will accept my genuine appreciation for you coming on tonight and sharing with us about this way of speaking that allows us to have a real, alive connection with each other, which is what we're all seeking. And I really appreciate that.
And I'm so glad to do it.
Thank you.
I appreciate you, creating this opportunity.
Thank you. I love hosting you. Jeff, I want to give you an opportunity to let other people know how they can connect with you if they want to work with you personally. And so we're going to be putting your website in the links on the replay. Can you just tell us what your website is?
Okay, it's compassionateinteractions.com. And you can also go there, and you can learn nonviolent communication on it. It has explanations and exercises and practices on it.
And another guest, Maitri, said thank you as well. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to be wrapping up the recording, but if you're a guest on the call, please stay on so that you can have conversations. If you come on our Meet Yogis in the future, you will have an opportunity to actually speak with our guest after the recording's done. And I also would have really appreciated if you would hit the like button, share, subscribe. All of these things help the work that we're doing to be seen by more people. Thank you so much for joining us on the replay. And thank you again, Jeff, for being here.